The UK government has a housing target of 300,000 new homes per year. The actual number being built is considerably below that. Most of the political and media conversation around that gap focuses on planning reform, land availability, and the overall volume of house building. What receives considerably less attention is a shift happening within the mix of housing being built that is arguably just as significant as the total volume shortfall. The homes that are being built are, with increasing consistency, not the homes that families with children actually need. They are smaller, they are more likely to be apartments than houses, and they are more likely to be built in locations and at price points that serve investors and first-time buyers, rather than the growing households that need a third or fourth bedroom, a garden, school proximity, and the kind of stable neighbourhood that supports a family through the long arc of raising children. I have been tracking the UK property market for years, and the quiet but systematic decline in the production of new family-sized homes is one of the least discussed consequences of the development economics that now govern almost every significant residential project in the country. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly why this is happening, what specific forces in the development system produce this outcome, and what it means for families currently trying to find suitable housing in a market that is structurally building less of what they need every year. This is not primarily a story about planning obstruction or greenbelt constraints, though those play a role. It is a story about the specific financial logic that governs residential development in the UK and that consistently produces a mix of housing different from what the country's families actually need. Let's start with development economics, because that is where every explanation for what gets built and what does not begins. A residential developer does not choose what to build based on what the housing market most needs. They choose what to build based on what generates the best return on the capital they have invested in the land and construction costs, within the constraints of the planning permission they have been granted. That is not a criticism of developers as individuals or as a sector. It is simply how the financial model of private house building works, and understanding it is essential to understanding why the output of that model so consistently fails to match the actual household demand profile of the country it is building for. Red flag number 1, the viability calculation that systematically favours smaller units over larger ones. In the development appraisal model that determines whether a site is commercially viable to develop, the kill metric is typically the gross development value relative to the total cost of development, including land acquisition, construction, finance, planning obligations and sales costs. Smaller units produce a higher value per square metre than larger units in most UK markets, because the entry price for a 1 or 2 bedroom flat or small house is accessible to a much larger pool of buyers than the entry price for a 4-bedroom house, and developers can sell a larger number of smaller units on the same site area than they can larger units, generating more total sales revenue for a given land cost. The family home, with its larger floor area, larger garden requirement, more complex internal layout, and lower value per square metre, simply produces a worse return on the same land cost, and the development finance model makes that trade-off visible in every project appraisal. A developer choosing between building 24-bedroom family homes and 42-bedroom apartments on the same site is not choosing between two equivalent options. They are choosing between a lower return and a higher return use of the same capital, and the financial model that funds the development and determines whether the site is viable at all will almost always point in the same direction. Red flag number 2, the planning obligation burden that falls most heavily on larger, more profitable developments and that incentivizes smaller builds. When a developer obtains planning permission for a residential development above a certain size threshold, they are typically required to make a financial contribution to affordable housing, either by including a percentage of affordable units within the development or by making a cash payment in lieu. The amount of that contribution is calculated as a proportion of the development's viability, meaning that a more financially viable development faces a larger planning obligation, and a less financially viable development faces a smaller one or none at all. Smaller developments that fall below the affordable housing threshold, which varies by local authority but is often 10 or 15 units, avoid the affordable housing obligation entirely, creating a specific financial incentive to develop below that threshold rather than above it, and to keep individual development phases small enough to avoid triggering the obligation. This thresholds effect contributes to a development pattern of smaller sites, smaller phases, and smaller unit sizes that systematically avoids the planning obligations attached to larger developments. Red flag number 3. The infrastructure cost asymmetry that makes larger family homes disproportionately expensive to develop in locations where families actually want to live. Building a family-sized home in a suburb with good schools, access to parks, and the kind of neighborhood infrastructure that families require typically means building in an established residential area where land is expensive, where existing residents and planning authorities resist high-density development, and where the infrastructure costs of providing roads, drainage, utilities, and open space for a lower-density development are higher per unit than for a high-density apartment scheme. The locations where family housing is actually most needed, near good schools and with access to the amenities that make raising children practical, are frequently the locations where development economics work least favorably for family-size units, while the locations where apartments and smaller units pencil most easily financially, town and city centres, brownfield sites, regeneration zones, are often the locations that are least suitable for families with children. Red flag number 4, the design standards evolution that has produced smaller rooms, smaller gardens, and smaller overall units across the entire new build market. Successive updates to space standards, design guidance, and planning policy have in many local authority areas failed to keep pace with the rising expectation among families for genuinely usable space, either because the standards are set at minimum acceptable levels rather than genuinely comfortable ones, or because developers have become skilled at designing layouts that technically meet the standards while producing homes that feel considerably smaller in practice than the square footage figures suggest. The average new build home in England is, by international standards, among the smallest in the developed world, and the average new build family home specifically has not grown in floor area in proportion to the expectations of the families who are the intended market for it. A family comparing a new-build 4-bedroom home to the 4-bedroom Victorian or Edwardian terraced house it is nominally equivalent to in bedroom count will frequently find that the new build offers meaningfully less total usable floor area, smaller individual rooms, less storage, a smaller or no garden, and a layout that has been optimized for minimum construction cost rather than for the daily reality of family life with multiple children at different ages and stages.
Red flag number 5, the Help to Buy legacy that shaped a decade of new build development toward the first-time buyer and away from the family mover. The Help to Buy equity loan scheme, which operated from 2013 to 2023 in various forms, provided government-backed equity loans to buyers of new build properties up to a specific value cap. Because the scheme was primarily used by first-time buyers rather than family movers, and because developers were aware that their most likely buyers for scheme-supported properties were single people and young couples rather than established families, the development industry oriented itself toward producing the type of product that Help to Buy buyers wanted: 1- and 2-bedroom apartments and small starter homes, rather than the larger, more expensive family homes that did not qualify for the scheme or that were priced above the value cap. That decade of orientation toward the Help to Buy buyer has left a development industry whose skills, land acquisition strategy, product design, and sales infrastructure are all calibrated toward a buyer profile that is not the family mover. Reorienting that industry toward genuinely family-sized product would not simply require a change in planning conditions, it would require a fundamental shift in where developers seek land, how they design layouts, how they market and sell, and how they finance development. Changes that would take years to implement, even if the policy environment actively encouraged them. Now, here is what connects all of these red flags together. The shortage of new family homes is not a planning failure, a developer malice story, or a simple political will problem. It is the predictable output of a development system whose financial model, planning obligations framework, infrastructure cost structure, and historical policy incentives all point in the same direction: away from large, expensive, lower density family homes and toward smaller, cheaper, higher density units that produce better returns on the same land, avoid planning obligation thresholds, and serve the buyer profiles that have historically been most incentivized by government housing schemes. The gap between what the development system is optimized to produce and what growing families actually need is structural rather than accidental, and closing it would require changes to development economics that go well beyond any individual planning reform. Until those changes arrive, the family home shortage will continue generating exactly the outcomes it has been generating for the last decade: rising prices in the resale market for larger homes, growing overcrowding in properties that are no longer large enough for the households occupying them, and a new build output that keeps hitting housing targets in number while quietly missing them in type.
I spoke with a house builder who works on residential developments at a range of scales, and off the record, their assessment was blunt. They said the decision about unit mix on any development site, meaning the ratio of 1- and 2-bedroom units to 3- and 4-bedroom ones, is driven almost entirely by the development appraisal rather than by any genuine assessment of local housing need. They said in their experience, planning authorities routinely require a proportion of larger family-sized units as a condition of planning permission, and developers routinely price those required larger units at levels the development viability model demands, which frequently prices them out of the reach of the actual families who need them. They said the result is developments that technically contain the required proportion of larger units, but that are effectively unavailable to the families who need them, either because the price is too high or because the product design, despite the nominally larger floor area, does not actually function well for a family with children. They gave a specific example of a development they had worked on where the planning authority had required 30% of units to be 3-bedroom or larger, and where the 3-bedroom units that resulted had been designed to the minimum standard and priced at a level that satisfied the viability model for the site but was above what most local families could actually afford, producing a development where the required larger units sat on the market considerably longer than the smaller units and were eventually purchased primarily by investors rather than the families the planning condition was intended to serve. So, what does this mean practically? First, for families currently looking for a new build home, understand that the new build market is not currently producing large volumes of genuinely well-designed family homes, and that the search for a new build property that works for a family with 2 or more children may need to include older stock, extensions of existing property, and resale rather than new build as the primary options. Second, for policymakers and planning authorities, the unit mix condition in planning permissions has limited effectiveness if the financial model of development means that required larger units are priced or designed in ways that make them inaccessible to the families they are supposed to serve. Third, for buyers considering a new build family home, assess the actual room dimensions, garden size, and storage provision of the specific property, rather than relying on the bedroom count, because a nominally 4-bedroom new build may have rooms that are functionally too small for a family's actual needs, in a way that a 3-bedroom older property may not. Fourth, if you are a family currently living in a property that no longer fits your household, consider whether extending the existing property is a more cost-effective and more functionally satisfying solution than purchasing a new build, since the new build market is unlikely to offer the combination of space, garden, location, and price that the family market actually requires at any price point that is genuinely competitive with an extended or enlarged older property. Here is how I expect this to develop. The structural incentives pushing development away from family homes are unlikely to change significantly without deliberate policy intervention that changes either the viability model, the planning obligations framework, or the infrastructure cost allocation for family housing in desirable locations. Expect continued political discussion of the family home shortage without the deeper structural reforms that would be needed to actually address it, and expect the gap between household formation, which is producing more families who need larger homes, and new build output, which is producing fewer of those homes, to continue widening until either prices in the resale family home market rise enough to create new development viability for genuinely large units, or until a policy intervention specifically targets the development economics that produce the current outcome. It is also worth noting that the family home shortage interacts directly with the broader issue of housing stock immobility, since older couples who have raised their families and would like to downsize from a large family home cannot easily do so if there is no suitable smaller property available, which in turn means those large family homes stay occupied by smaller households and never become available to the growing families who need them, compounding the shortage at both ends of the transaction simultaneously. The uncomfortable truth is that the house-building industry is building for the buyer it has been financially incentivized to serve for the last decade, not for the household profile that the country's demographics most require. The first-time buyer, the investor, the downsizer, and the single professional all find a new build market well calibrated to their needs. The family with 2 or 3 children looking for a 4-bedroom house with a functional garden in a neighborhood with decent schools finds a new build market that was not
really built with them in mind, and that is unlikely to reorient itself in their direction without changes to the financial architecture of residential development that are considerably more fundamental than anything currently being debated. The housing crisis conversation has, for understandable reasons, focused on the total number of homes being built, but a target number of new homes hit entirely through studio apartments and one-bedroom flats does not solve the family housing shortage. Quantity and type are both part of the problem, and only one of them is currently anywhere near the center of the policy discussion.